I'm Camille Sugrum, and joining me is Janelle Stanton from myHRcounsel. And we are very excited to talk to you today about some really important, giving you some really important tips and tricks around how to deal with workplace misconduct in your organization and in 2020. And so I'll turn it over to Janelle to introduce herself.
Great. Thank you so much, Camille. So just welcome everybody as you're kind of filtering in here. We've got some attendees still joining us, but we really do appreciate you taking the time to join us today to talk about workplace misconduct and learn a little bit about both of our companies and how we are jointly able to help you guys wade through anti-harassment, anti-discrimination issues. So I'm just going to quickly go over the agenda here and a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, if you have questions, please feel free to write those in the webinar box. There's a place where you can type out your questions. So if you have questions as we go through, I will be looking at those and addressing those. If it's timely, I'll address it right away. Otherwise, we may just hold off until the end to get those questions answered. A couple of other things. So we are recording the presentation today. So after the webinar today, you're going to get an email. So watch for that in the next couple of days here. That email is going to have a link to the recording of the presentation. We will have the slides available to you. And then we will also be sending out the HRCI credit code. So for those of you that need to get HRCI certification, recertification credits, you're going to get 1 credit hour for attending live today. So just be on the lookout for that as well. But a couple of things to note. It sometimes takes a little while for us to be able to get the full recording of the presentation downloaded. So I would say look for this email in the next couple of days. And sometimes, I don't know why, but the email gods send our emails into spam and junk folders. So just keep an eye on those as well, but watch for that in the coming days. So we're going to talk about some examples of workplace misconduct. We will talk about anti-harassment policy must-haves, safe reporting and resolutions, and then we're going to talk more about myHRcounsel and People First, and then talk about a special offer for those that are attending today regarding our joint offering. So stick with us. We definitely want this to be more of a learning experience, but we do want to tell you a little bit about how our companies work together and, like I said, get you that special offer. And so just so you guys know, too, I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and where we're finally getting some decent weather around here, and Camille is in Europe. And so we have a little bit of a lag between us, and so we're co-presenting this material. I just want to say if there's some lag time or some overlap, we are doing our best to sort of fight some lag in our communication here. So please bear with us. But I think we've got a great presentation for you guys today. So let us know if you have questions, but otherwise I'm going to turn it over to Camille to talk to us about our first slide here.
Great, thanks, Janelle. So one of the things that we wanted to do when we were putting together the content for this webinar is to really talk a little bit about the definition of workplace misconduct. So when some people think about workplace misconduct, and the media is certainly driving a lot of this definition, they think that 80% of it is sexual harassment, and about 10% is gender, and then there's the rest of it just falls into this other category. But the reality is that workplace misconduct is actually a much more complicated thing and has a breakdown that's much more different than what you see in the media. So sexual harassment is about 15% of the cases. There's gender discrimination, offensive language, age discrimination, racial discrimination. These are all the categories as defined by the EEOC. And this is kind of what the breakdown of workplace misconduct looks like for a typical company. So despite what you see in the media, it's actually a lot more of the categories that the EEOC defines as workplace misconduct, and it can actually touch on more topics than sexual harassment. And I know that Janelle's got some really great examples of these other types of harassment that she's going to go through right now for you.
Yes, thanks, Camille. So yeah, this is always an interesting thing because again, I think that like Camille pointed out, sexual harassment is sort of on everybody's radar after the Harvey Weinstein revelations, and then shortly after that, we had this. It's like every day there was some new person, usually a man in power, that was being investigated, and so sexual harassment really sprung to the forefront, and it definitely still is a pervasive issue in workplaces. But I think it's important for us to remember that there are many other types of harassment and discrimination that are out there that are just as important to pay attention to and can get companies in just as much trouble. So I'm going to go through a few different examples of that and kind of talk about each one in turn. And then I'm going to talk about what type of anti-harassment, anti-discrimination policy you should put in place. So this is a very recent case here, this first one. It came out of the state of Oregon. And so what happened was a Black employee had complained of rampant racial discrimination in his workplace. He worked for a towing company in Oregon, and so he had raised the complaint about discrimination that he was facing to his employer, which is exactly what we want employees to be doing. But again, we'll touch more on that in the future. But what happened was the employee's boss had a buddy that was on the local police force, and so he called up his police officer friend, and he asked him to investigate a knowingly false claim of theft. So he said, hey, we've got this trouble employee. This isn't true, but, why don't you pick him up and scare him a little bit, bring him into the office. He was detained at the police department for 8 hours. Again, both the boss and the police officer, both knowing that this employee had done nothing other than complained of racial discrimination in the workplace. And then when the police let him go, because they didn't file any charges against him, they called him up and said, hey, come back to the jail. You need to pick up some belongings that you left. And the police officer informed this employee that he was fired. So rather than the company doing this, the employee's boss asked the police officer to do the firing for him. So in this situation, the employee brought suit both against the employer and also against, and this is in the city of Portland, so also brought a claim against the police department. And so in this situation, the employee actually ended up winning over $1 million. He got $415,000 from his employer, and he got over $500,000 from the police department. And it turns out this is actually one of the biggest settlements that an individual has gotten against this police department in its history. So a very interesting case here where this Black employee did exactly what we would urge him to do, which is report racial discrimination happening in the workplace. And instead of taking the complaint seriously, doing an investigation and disciplining the wrongdoers, the employer and his boss, they went through and absolutely retaliated against this employee for making that report. And so as you can see here, we all kind of know on its face when we hear these stories, oh, that's not right, you can't do that. But a couple of our other examples here I think will be even maybe bring it a little bit more home as well. So this is an interesting case because most of the time, most cases do involve a woman as the victim of sexual discrimination. But here we've actually got a man who ended up being the victim of sex discrimination. So Gentlemen's Club in Florida has the employee, the man applying for the job, he was not an employee, he was an applicant, but he applied for a job as a bartender at this particular club, and the club was refused to take him seriously. He went to a different location to pick up a job application. At the different location, he was told, no, you can't have a job application. We only hire women as bartenders in this particular club. And so because of that, he brought suit into the company for gender discrimination, and the employee won $20,000. Now, at first blush, you might look at this settlement and think, oh, $20,000, I mean, that's not that much. But I want you to think through a couple of things that are going to happen here. So this is, so he sued. This isn't a settlement. There was a lawsuit that the EEOC filed on behalf of the employee. So the employer needed to hire an attorney to represent him. And although they had gone through some pre-litigation settlements, it didn't work out, and this did actually get filed. So this gentleman's club, in addition to having to pay out the $20,000, also had to pay to retain an attorney, also is going to suffer potentially loss of, morale in the community, loss of reputation, and their company was splashed all over the EEOC press releases. And so outside of just the $20,000, there are other costs there as well. And I hear this one a lot too. I hear companies, when they see things like this, like a $20,000 settlement, I'll often hear clients of ours come to me and say, well, yeah, I understand, but I've got EPLI insurance, so I'm fine, I'm covered. And my response to that is always, okay, I have car insurance, but I don't drive the wrong way down a one-way so that I can cause a bunch of accidents and have a claim. You don't want to have a claim. First of all, EPLI, there is a deductible to it, so it's not without cost. Second of all, if you do get a settlement against you, many EPLI policies don't cover the settlement figure. So they might cover your defense, but they don't cover if you're fined or there's some type of settlement against you. And so other EPLI policies have a lot of exceptions. So they may not represent you on a wrongful termination claim. They may only cover you for wage and hour litigation. So you don't really want to just rest on your laurels and say, great, I've got EPLI coverage, this is fine. Even though $20,000 may not seem like a huge settlement, this gentleman's club is on the radar of the EEOC. They had to pay out $20,000. They had to pay for an attorney potentially, and who knows if their EPLI coverage dropped them after this. So there's a lot of other consequences that go hand in hand with having to face down one of these types of discrimination lawsuits. Another case here, I don't know what it is, but in the last maybe 2 or 3 months, I've seen quite a few cases involving Seventh-day Adventists. So in this situation, this was a fruit and vegetable distributor in North Carolina. They're a family nursery. They've been family-owned for 50 years, very long time. And so they were sued by a Seventh-day Adventist employee that they had. And so according to the complaint, the employee sincerely held religious belief that she should not engage in any labor on the Sabbath, which is sundown on Friday to, I believe, sun up on Sunday. I can't remember the dates, but essentially they're not supposed to be working, maybe sunset on Saturday, but they're not supposed to work during the day on Saturday. And for a long time, the fruit and vegetable distributor, the company, they had supported the employee in that, and they allowed her not to work on Saturdays. A new manager came in and said, nope, we are going to require that all employees work 7 days a week. Nobody gets an exception to this, and they rejected the employee's request to not work on Saturday. And so what happens is obviously the employee here wins $12,500. And for this company, which is a fairly small nursery and distributor, again, that $12,500 was what was paid out in damages. But again, this is also a lawsuit, so there's the attorney's fees, there's many other fees that work into this. And so the point here being, religious discrimination is also going to potentially lead to these types of situations where here, the employer, they had accommodated the employee's request to not work on Saturdays for a while. Once they got a new employee, a new manager in, they changed up the rules and then did not even consider whether they could accommodate the employee's request to not work on Saturdays. There was no discussion even had about whether that was a possible accommodation. So again, whether it's race discrimination, sexual harassment, or sex discrimination, discrimination on the basis of religion, there are many, many different types of harassment and discrimination that you've got to be on the lookout for. So along those lines, you definitely want to make sure that you have these 5 must-haves in your anti-harassment policy. And, we'll talk about this more too. A policy is only as good as your procedure. So in addition to having this policy in place, you've got to make sure that you're following it. But one of the most important things that your a great, well-crafted, legally compliant anti-harassment policy is going to have a definition of what is considered harassment and discrimination. And so you should go over the different types of laws that are included in what is considered harassment and discrimination. So that includes things like Title VII and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That law prohibits discrimination by an employer on the basis of race, religion, sex, and national origin. So that's one of the big laws there. That law has been supplemented by additional legislation that prohibits discrimination on the basis of pregnancy under the Pregnancy Disability Act, discrimination based on age under the ADEA, discrimination on the basis of disability, which is a huge topic. If you look at the recent press releases from the EEOC that relate to ADA and discrimination, there is a lot of discrimination cases and settlements being enforced against employers for things like lack of access to public spaces, failure to provide reasonable accommodations under the ADA to an employee that's suffering from a mental health crisis, things like that. So making sure that your policy defines all of those various protected classes and understanding that protected classes are different depending on the state that you're in. So, for example, the state of Minnesota, you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of past, present, or future service in the military. In the state of Florida, you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of having sickle cell trait. There are laws being passed. There's New York, New Jersey, California have new laws that make discrimination on the basis of hair, texture, and style discrimination in a protected class. So just be aware and make sure that your policy has all the federal protected classes listed, but also the specific states that you're in. You also want to talk about the types of actions that are prohibited. So taking adverse employment action against an employee on the basis of protected class. So that's things like demoting an employee, suspending an employee, terminating an employee. You want to make sure that you're spelling out that any adverse employment action taken because of protected class status is considered discrimination and is prohibited under your policy. You also want to make sure that you feel that you explain that disparate treatment between members, different members of protected classes with regards to hiring, promotion, evaluations, or discipline is prohibited. So you can't treat people of a different race or people of a different national origin or people of a different gender differently with regard to promoting or disciplining them. That's going to lead to a disparate impact claim. And again, disparate treatment based on protected class is prohibited. Also, failure to accommodate. So you want to point out in your policy that a failure to accommodate various religion or disability is a type of action that is prohibited by the policy. And again, I mean, the example being this. So here, they failed to accommodate this employee's sincerely held religious beliefs, and they had to pay. So you want to make sure that you're spelling out failure to accommodate is prohibited by the policy as well. And then I also think it's a good idea and recommended to spell out regarding sexual harassment that sexual harassment is any sexual advance or conduct of a sexual nature that occurs when submission to the advance is made, an explicit or implicit condition of employment or used as a basis for employment decisions. It's also wise to spell out the different examples that sexual harassment can be verbal, it can be physical, and it can be nonverbal. So spelling out some of the different actions that constitute sexual harassment should definitely be in a policy as well. I will say this next part is probably the part that most employers are missing when I look at their anti-harassment policies. You want to make very sure that your employees know exactly how to lodge a complaint. They need to know that if something happens to them at the office or at a happy hour or at a holiday party or anywhere, that they know exactly who they can take that complaint to and how they can make the complaint. So if you've got a form that you want them to use and you want them to fill it out and you want them to provide it to the HR director, tell them who the HR director is and how they get the form. If they don't feel comfortable going to the HR director, give them another level of person that they can go to with that complaint. If the complaint involves their supervisor, make sure they understand they can take the complaint directly to the president. I mean, it depends on what type of company you have and how big it is, but make sure that they know who that complaint should be made to. If they want to call a phone number, give a few different methods. If you have People First amazing services, make sure that your employees know how to use the software and the platform so that they can make the complaints as they come up. So just whatever your complaint procedure is, make sure you communicate that very clearly to your employees, because what ultimately we're trying to do is encourage very frank and very open complaint process here. Another component of a well-drafted anti-harassment policy is a zero tolerance statement. I know this may seem so obvious that it's, well, why does it even need to be in there? And the reason it needs to be in there is because you want your employees to know that regardless of who the complaint is against, if the complaint is against the CEO, if the complaint is against your company's highest paying client, your company's most valuable vendor, that it doesn't matter who the perpetrator of the harassment is, that your company is going to take that seriously and that swift and immediate action will be taken to correct that in the future. So the zero tolerance statement is very, very important, and you've got to live by that. I know, because I counsel employers every single day, that when that complaint comes in and it involves a CEO, a president, a really important client, it's very, very difficult to, as an HR person, feel that you have the authority or position to investigate those types of claims. You do, you're required to, and if the company won't take action, that's when you may end up in the newspaper, you may end up calling your EPLI carrier, or you may end up paying out thousands of dollars to an employee. So if it's not taken seriously, the ramifications can be huge. And then you should also make sure that you spell out that retaliation is prohibited. I can't tell you how many times I've seen cases where a client has an employee that's complained about harassment, and now all of a sudden that employee has terrible performance, they've been a terrible employee forever, they don't have any documentation of that, but they want to let the employee go. Terminating an employee contemporaneous to a complaint of harassment or discrimination is always going to be tricky, especially if you don't have any documentation and this is a new thing. So you want to make sure that you're really making your employees feel very confident that they are not going to be retaliated against for raising these particular claims. And retaliation doesn't just have to be termination. It's any adverse treatment after they've engaged in protected activity. So it can take the form of termination, demotion, or suspension. It can include harassment or intimidation. There was a case that I saw a couple of years ago now, but the employee made a claim against her employer for harassment. And all of a sudden now the boss who she complained against, she was seeing his car idling outside of her home at night after work in an apparent attempt to threaten her and make her feel scared for making this report. So retaliation doesn't have to just be you're fired because you made this claim. There are other actions that a company can take that can amount to retaliation, which again is prohibited and can get a company sued. So with that, I'm going to pass it, and I do know we have a couple of questions here, but I see them. I want to make sure I pointed out that I've got your question. I think we'll address that toward the end. So I want to give Camille a chance to get into talking about her part of the presentation here.
Great. Thanks, Janelle. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the data behind workplace misconduct and the data that you see around it in your organization. So according to the EEOC, only 10% of workplace misconduct and discrimination and harassment cases are reported. That means 90% of the discrimination and harassment that's happening in an organization goes unreported. That 90% is a very significant number. It represents the legal and cultural liability and exposure the company faces due to non-reporting. So when we talk to CEOs, we often, hear things like, "Oh, we don't have a lot of workplace discrimination and harassment," or "It's very small." And what we say to them is that a small amount of it is being reported due to fear of retaliation, due to ambiguity around processes, due to employees not really understanding what their rights are. And so that doesn't mean that it's not happening. It just means that it's being unreported. But it's still impacting the culture of your company, and it's still a legal liability for you, because if harassment or discrimination is not reported, you're unable to really see fully what's happening in your organization. So I think that what it was really important to us, we're a software company, what's really important for us is to help our customers see the full amount of data that's happening in their organization around this topic. And what they see come through today is only a small representation of it. And we hope by changing what you see in terms of the data, you'll be able to actually change some of the processes in your organization and actually create a very safe workplace. So on the next slide, I have a very simple formula for how to do this. So it's about transparency, accountability, and closure. And a combination of all three of these leads to safe workplace. And so you might say, Camille, where's training and where is where's our handbook and things like that? Those are very important things for a company to have, but that they alone don't prevent workplace misconduct. They inform employees about your values and standards. They let people know their rights, but they don't actually are not proven to stop someone from saying something offensive, racially discriminating, or sexually harassing someone. And that's important to know that, there's more that needs to be done besides just putting a code of conduct in place and having training. So I'm going to break down all of these for you and kind of tell you a little bit about how they can play out in the organization. So let's start with transparency. So transparency is really important both for the employees and the employers. On the employee side, it's really important for an employee to understand if they report an issue, where that's going to go, how it's going to be handled, when they're going to hear back. And because most employees don't really understand this, even though you may have something written in your handbook, because it's not clear and systematic, most employees will choose not to report until a case or an incident gets unbearable for them and might be much more difficult for you to resolve. So on their side, they really need transparency in order to understand where their case is going, how it's being handled, and what the outcome is going to be. But on the employer side, as I mentioned before, transparency is equally as important, because if you don't know what's happening in your organization, and if you don't know some of the incidents that are happening, then you're unable to really course correct that, and you're unable to really work on the culture and the development of your organization. So you not receiving data and not seeing transparently into your organization hurts you, and an employee not having a transparent process hurts them as well. I think this visual is kind of just a funny depiction of what everyone thinks when they put together a process on paper. They think it's very clear and transparent, but when you look at it, it's actually kind of like a maze for most people, especially for employees that are new. You may go over a process once a year, you may go over it during onboarding or orientation, and then it's quickly kind of forgotten, and it's very hard to come back to and help that employee understand how they're supposed to navigate a workplace misconduct situation. In terms of accountability, this is also something that needs to be managed on both the employee side and the employer side. So on the employee side, an employee needs to really give you all of the information that they have around their complaint. And they need to kind of do that in a systematic way, so you have all of the information that you need to truly and authentically investigate what's happening. But they also need to know what's happening. They need to understand where a case goes once they submit it, or once they tell you what happens, who's handling the case, who's not handling the case, how is their data being protected. Quite often, employees are reporting someone that is more senior to them, and so they fear retaliation, they fear exposure of their data, and you need a process in place that makes sure that they understand who's going to be held accountable for their case, who holds their data, how their data is being protected, and what their rights are and how their rights are being protected. On the employer side, accountability is equally important. I think, as Janelle has pointed out in a lot of cases, an employer needs to, there's a lot of press around how employers mishandle cases, but there are a lot of instances where employers do handle cases correctly, but they don't have clear documentation of how they've handled that. They don't have documentation of how they've resolved a case, and they don't actually have the resolution that they've put forth clearly stated. And then when they're, as Janelle has mentioned in the past, when they are thinking of reprimanding an employee for performance or firing an employee around performance, workplace misconduct might come up, and then they don't have any evidence really that they've dealt with this and the employees agreed. And so this whole notion of accountability and the lack of accountability or transparency around the accountability leaves the employer kind of struggling to show that they have done a good job, if they have indeed done a good job. So accountability is really important on both sides, on the employee side and on the employer side. And I think that, any system or process that you put in place has to have dual accountability. Otherwise, it's an imbalanced relationship, and that's usually when the cases kind of explode and get bigger and more complicated. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the last thing, which I think a lot of people skip over, which is closure. And so closure is probably the most important thing in addressing workplace misconduct. Often when you have a case, HR or management will say, this is what we believe should happen, and you don't have a record that the employees agreed to it. And the employee often doesn't feel like they have a say in stating what they desire or want. What we find in the cases that are filed on our platform is that a lot of employees ask to either be, have the harassment somehow stop, or the discrimination stop. They might say something like, I don't think we should use visual in presentations because I find it, racially offensive. Or they might say, I don't like to report to John Doe because I don't like it makes me uncomfortable and I'd like a new manager. So when we don't give the employee a voice in the closure and asking them what they want, we can often suggest something that doesn't meet their needs, and the employer can assume that a case is resolved, and it's actually not resolved in the employee's mind. So mutual closure is really important, and kind of both having agreed on what the solution is and recording that is actually very important for a company. On the legal side, it shows that the employer has closed the case, that an employee has agreed, and that if there is any retaliation that happens, the employee can sort of come back and say, okay, well, we agreed to this, but there's still retaliation happening, or there's a new thing that's happened as a result of the case. But you have a basis of agreement that you're working off of, which I think really helps the cases. And so I think all of that, has to kind of come together in a system for you. I think what employers are doing today is they're kind of dealing with these three things very separately, and they're disconnected, and they cause a disjointed experience, not only for the employee, but the employer. According to the EEOC, it takes an employer about 275 days to resolve a case. That's as long as it takes to birth a child, just so in case anybody was trying to do the math in their head. And the reason that a huge part of the reason that these cases take so long is because this formula is broken in an organization. There's not enough transparency. There's very little accountability. No one has agreed on closure. And this sort of elongates what is already a stressful process for both the employee and the employer. And it leads to more risk and exposure around cases that could probably be closed out very early. And if you had that structure in place. And so with that, I wanted I think Janelle's going to tell us a little bit about myHRcounsel, and I'll come back and tell you a little bit about the People First platform, and then we'll tell you what we're doing together.
Awesome, thanks, Camille. I did have one question here, and it was relating to religious accommodations. I'm just going to answer that question here quickly, and then I'll jump into the next slide. So the question that I got was, what about in a union environment? So due to seniority, all employees are required to work weekends. How do we handle religious accommodation with union employees? So that's a really great question, because there are certain workforces where working on a Saturday or working a Sunday, working during other religious, periods of time, religious observances, is going to be a requirement. And it may be by contract, it may be because it's a busy season for your company. And so providing a religious accommodation to an employee may be difficult, if not impossible. So in a situation with a union employee, when you've got a collective bargaining agreement in place, that always makes things a little bit more tricky, because you do need to look into whether you've got to negotiate with the union on behalf of that employee. Because if you violate the collective bargaining agreement that's already in place, then you're going to have a whole host of issues on its own. So if all employees are required to work on weekends, and that's part of what's been collectively bargained for, and that employee is in that union, it's very possible you may not be able to accommodate that union employee. I would still recommend, though, looking into what your options are, especially in that situation with the union, because you need to read the collective bargaining agreement and see what it says about that. So unfortunately, every CBA is very different. So without reading it, knowing exactly how to handle this particular situation is very difficult. But certainly, if you are a client of ours, we'd be happy to, review that collective bargaining agreement for you and see what type of resolution is available. So, but great question. So there may be times when you can accommodate it, and there may be times, unfortunately, when you cannot. So, but yes, great question. So I know that I looked at the attendee list before the call today, so I know that quite a few of you guys are clients of ours already. But I do want to give a little bit of background about us, and People First is then going, Camille's going to talk about People First and their platform. And we do have a couple of slides to finish up as well, just to sort of address some of the myths about sexual harassment, discrimination, before we wrap everything up. But myHRcounsel, for those of you that are not currently working with us or haven't heard of us before, we have changed the way that small and medium-sized companies are getting access to legal guidance. Many of you as smaller companies will understand that there is an older model of the law firm that may not incentivize a small and medium-sized company because you cannot afford necessarily to go in and not understand what the cost is going to be to get advice from an attorney. And we wanted to change that. And most of the time, employers are going to an attorney when their hair is on fire. They've already been sued, they've got a complaint, they've let an employee go, and all of a sudden now they think it's a litigation risk. We wanted to change that model as well. So instead of billing hourly, we have a flat per employee per month charge that we bill, and then we also offer our services in a way that it's unlimited. So you get unlimited questions of our team of attorneys, 24/7 access to the portal, and we want you to come to us for these types of things, to get policies in place before you get sued, to get procedures in place before a complaint arises. Our whole goal is to keep employers compliant at the forefront. And like I said, we work with companies both big and small, but honestly, we really don't think that having, counsel on retainer is kind of how we like to put it, it should not just be a privilege of the biggest, wealthiest companies. So we want to give companies, large and small, the ability to access quality legal counsel on a flat fee basis so that you don't have to pay the lawsuits that we just talked about, so that you don't have to drive the wrong way down the one way and cause a bunch of accidents and use your insurance. We don't want that. Let's make sure that our policies and procedures, the way that we're doing our business is correct at the forefront, and it will head off these issues at the pass. So again, many of you are already clients of ours, so adding on People First will be an addition that you can talk about. If you don't already have our services, we'll talk about a module that we think works really well with People First software platform. But I'm going to turn it over to Camille to touch on what People First does and how their service can make sure that your complaint procedure, like I talked about, is so important, make sure your complaint procedure is buttoned up.
Great, thanks, Janelle. So People First is a software platform, and it is a software platform that allows employees to report cases and allows employers to resolve workplace misconduct cases. These are the critical components of it. At the beginning of it, there's a very simplified reporting procedure that allows an employee or a witness to open a case. They can answer 4 straightforward questions, click on the type of harassment or multiple types of harassment that they feel that they've endured, and actually upload all of the supporting information that they need. In this reporting, they also state their desired resolution. And we think that this is a really important feature that's missing out there when it comes to reporting tools, because if an employer doesn't know what would make the employee feel better and what would make this harassment issue in some ways go away for the employee, then they're just kind of guessing. So it really allows the employee to state what they'd like to happen. And then the employee can submit the case, and the employee sees the escalation path that the case is going to go through. The escalation path is defined by the employer, and this is really great because if you're a simple company, you may just have one escalation path, but if you're a little bit of a bigger company and you kind of want to work by departments and divisions, you can have multiple escalation paths. So the employee, sees the escalation path that pertains to them. So interesting questions that we always get about this is that what if someone has been named as a potential harasser or named person in a case and they're in the escalation path? In that case, that person is removed from the escalation path and they don't see the case until someone's ready to talk to them about it. We also allow the employer to put some counseling services and a little bit of some customized links to let the employee know what are some of the policies and procedures that the company has. Each escalation path has a fixed amount of days, and the employee receives a notification when the escalation when the case is at escalation path 1. If the case moves to escalation path 2, they know how many days are left, and the employer also knows where a case is at all times. So this is transparent just both for the employee but for the employer as well. There's a clear resolution, as I've stated earlier, and I think this is really important for closure. Both the employee and the company must agree on the resolution in order to close the report. And I think people, in the beginning when they see this, they say, well, what if the employee doesn't agree? But what we've found actually is by asking the employee what they'd like, the employer has a much simpler potential resolution to deal with, and the case is actually closed very quickly. And once a case is marked closed, we check in with the employee to see if they're experiencing retaliation. And so that happens 10, 30, 60, 90, 180, and then 180 days, and then after 1 year. This is both beneficial for the employee who can report any type of retaliation that's happening, but also for the employer. Not only do they see if retaliation is happening, but if there is a false claim of retaliation, they've got data that shows that they've been checking in and the employee has not reported anything. And that I think really helps employers when they have false claims. And then there's a lot of analytics and insight because there's loads of data here, and this data is extremely important, I think, for companies to run more effectively. You can see what types of harassment is happening in your company more, what types of discrimination are more prominent in your company. You can see who repeat offenders are. You can see even sort of like what departments and divisions have more harassment or discrimination cases than other divisions. You're really able to run your organization in a much more efficient manner when you have this kind of data. And you're also able to really understand sort of the effectiveness of your policies and procedures and your staff when it comes to this type of incidents in your company. And you also get to see progress and improvement. You may have a year where there was a particular issue that was prevalent in your company, like gender discrimination. And then a year later, you can see, based on the initiatives that you put in place, that the amount of cases have dropped dramatically, and you can see the effectiveness of some of the things that you put in place to improve your organization. So I think the data and analytics is really, really important. I think when people think about workplace misconduct and reporting it, they just see the negative side of it. They see, oh, this is going to point to something negative happening in my company. But what they don't see is the possibility for a vast amount of improvement to the culture and to the performance of the organization. And so on the next slide, I have a little bit of information about how we're doing with our customers. So we have about 50 customers and 3,500 users on the platform. We have a very high employee engagement rate, which is 80% of the employees in our customer base are voluntarily downloading and using People First to safely report incidents. There's been 100% mutual resolution of all of the cases, and no resolution has gone past level 2. And all of the resolutions have been resolved on average within 18 days. I think the shortest amount of time a case is taken to close is 3 days, and the longest time has been 30 days. And I think that was a quite complicated case. But it did also go to closure, and it only took 30 days versus 275, as I mentioned earlier, which is what the EEOC reports that a company can take to resolve a case. So we're seeing a lot of really great things happen with the platform for our customers. And what we hear from the CEOs of our organizations is that at first they were a little scared of the data, but what's really worked for them is that they're able to really proactively address this, and they're not just hearing about it on the employee survey, or hearing about it after someone's been felt that they've been discriminated or harassed 5, 6, 7 times when the problem is too big or very complex and very difficult to solve. They're getting to things very early. They're showing their commitment and dedication to their employees, and employees in turn are being able to give what would be very difficult feedback around the culture, and around some of the things that are happening in the organization in a very safe and transparent way. So we've gotten a lot of really great feedback that this data has actually been really helpful in terms of having more conversations with employees, and sort of easing what's in the past been a very tense situation between employees and employers, and around a very difficult topic like workplace misconduct. And so, as Janelle mentioned, we've got a very well, actually, Janelle, why don't we go to the offer, and then we'll come back to the myths, because I think that's always a fun thing to end on. So we have a very special offer. People First is $40 per user per year normally for customers, and that gives you the platform and the ability to customize some of the escalation paths and the data and analytics that I mentioned earlier. But we're offering it for $30 per user per year to all of the attendees at the webinar and myHRcounsel customers. And for customers who do not have myHRcounsel, we're offering a bundled package, which is $40 per user per year for both the myHRcounsel offerings that Janelle mentioned, as well as the People First platform. We think that this is a really great way to streamline all of your processes around this, make it very simple for you, so you can really focus on doing what it is you're supposed to be doing with your business. And so with that, let's go back a little bit to some of the myths, because I think that this was really a fun thing for Janelle and I to think about when we sat down to partner and to do this webinar. We hear a lot of things around this topic. It is a very high profile topic in the news right now, and it's portrayed in a very, what almost feels like a very unsolvable or difficult scenario. It's sort of like a company receives a workplace misconduct case, and there's just nothing they can do. But what we hear from some people is that they think if they put a system in place for reporting, they're going to have 10 times more cases than they already have. That's not really the case, because I told you earlier that only 10% of the cases are reported. So just because you have a little bit more reporting, that doesn't mean that you've had more workplace you're gonna have cases that are more complicated, or you're gonna have people sort of rushing. People, our customers have seen a slight increase in cases in the first 30 to 60 days, and then a leveling out of cases. And I think a lot of that is also because they've been able to resolve cases very quickly and sort of send a message out very quickly to the organization that they have a zero tolerance towards harassment, which, as Janelle has mentioned, is extremely important. So the minute they start solving the first few cases, the whole sort of culture and dynamic of the company changes. The second thing we hear a lot is, by having the employees, have a say in the resolution, they're going to incur more costs. People think that employers are going to write, I'd like $1 million paid out to me, and that's the only thing that's going to make me happy. But we haven't seen any desired resolution like that, and we think that what people really want to do is just work in a safe and inclusive environment, and they want to not feel discomfort when they come to work. And so their resolutions and their proposed resolutions are just about how to facilitate that. And I think that that's really important, because the whole notion of how costly workplace harassment can be is it can be when you don't resolve it. But when you quickly resolve it, it actually can probably be, in terms of dollars, no cost to you, because you're able to really address an employee's needs by either sort of relocating them to another manager, or issuing a statement that you don't want the culture to have a particular behavior or habit, and that's enough for an employee to feel that they are working in a safe environment. I think Janelle is going to address the last two, because those are things that she hears quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tina makes some great points here, and again, this is something that we do hear from our clients as well, is, the more complaints there are, the more legal fees there will be. And I promise you, I'm here to tell you this is absolutely not true, because encouraging an open and honest environment where your employees feel very free to come forward and make complaints about things that have happened to them. If they know that you're bought into the resolution of the case or the complaint, that what that does is it actually reduces the level of cases that happen, and then also reduces your potential exposure to legal fees. Because if an employee brings a complaint to you, you investigate it, you look into it, you either determine that it's with or without merit, or you terminate them, you discipline them, something like that happens. An attorney that represents employees, plaintiff's counsel, is going to come in and they're going to look at something, even if an employee does complain that maybe you've done something illegal. If a plaintiff's counsel comes in, you're going to be able to show, no, we take all complaints very seriously. We looked into it, we investigated it, it was closed within 6 days, 7 days. I promise you, if you have service here, if you have people for service, a plaintiff's attorney that sees that a case has reached resolution in 6 days is going to walk away. It's going to reduce your legal fees because they're going to know that you have an open and honest communication system with your employees where you encourage reporting, you encourage that these things get resolved internally. It does not increase legal fees. Second of all, another thing we hear about, and this is common from a lot of our clients as well, is most people are thinking that when a complaint of harassment or discrimination comes up, the only way to handle it is to fire somebody. And there are absolutely cases where people need to be fired. So with that situation that I explained about the police officer, that, where the manager talked the officer into doing this investigation, that manager needs to be fired like 3 years ago, probably. So there are certainly situations where termination is absolutely 100% appropriate. However, oftentimes just sitting down with both of the employees and saying, don't do this anymore. I'm very sorry that you experienced this. Let's work out a compromise, or let's talk this out. That is probably going to be sufficient in most situations. So don't automatically jump to, oh, well, now we have a complaint, and so now we got to fire somebody. That isn't the case. Every situation is different and really needs to be examined. So encouraging reporting, encouraging resolution of these complaints is not going to cause you more trouble than what you had before. It is going to lead to a better workplace with stronger morale. Employees are going to feel very safe and comfortable coming to work, and they're not going to be dealing with the toxic issues of a toxic workplace. So just wanted to kind of cover those. And I do see a couple of questions that have come in. And so this question, and I may ask you to clarify this unless you understand this. So the question is, do you have safeguarding expertise in-house?
Safeguarding expertise.
And that's what I'm not quite sure what the question is.
Yeah, if you can type a clarification in the chat, we'll be happy to address it. Are there more questions, Janelle?
Yeah. So the other question, and I kind of already addressed this, but Camille, maybe you can, I don't know if you guys have any situations that have come up for you yet, but it's a question about harassment cases against a CEO or a leader in the company and how that would get handled. I mean, my position is it gets handled exactly the same way as any others. Do you have any advice or guidance on that?
Yeah, it it does in our system, it gets handled exactly the same way, and it should get handled the exact same way. I don't think that a CEO should be a case against a CEO should be treated any different than a case against a manager. In our system, if the CEO has access and the data has access to the data and the dashboard, so he or she sees all the cases that are coming in. If he or she is named as a harasser, they will be removed from the escalation path, and they wouldn't see that particular case until someone in the path approached them and said, hey, you've been named. And even then, they wouldn't see all of the sort of data in the case. They would see just what anybody else would see in terms of what HR allows them to see in a conversation around trying to understand the case. So they should be treated exactly the same. What we've seen a request for, I think with public companies or with companies, private companies with a board, we've seen some requests where our customers have said, hey, can we have the final escalation path actually be to the audit committee or the board of directors? And in that case, that would be the final path. But if a CEO is named and they're in the escalation path, they would be removed, and that's all to protect the employee.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And it looks like the question about the safeguarding, she may reach out to us offline,
Okay,
which is
great.
perfectly fine. You can definitely reach out to us offline to discuss as well. Well, so we're right up against the 2 o'clock hour here, or 2 o'clock Central Time, 3 Eastern, whatever time zone you're in. I know Camille will want to say, I just want to reiterate that please watch for a follow-up email in the next couple of days with all of the materials here. But we're so grateful for your attendance at our first joint webinar. And so, Camille, anything else that you wanted to add?
No, thank you so much for your time, and we really look forward to continuing the conversation with you. I think in the follow-up email, we'll also have our personal contact information. So if you have more questions or things come up later on as you watch or rewatch this or share with your teammates, we're really happy to answer them. We know it's a very complicated topic, so we're here to help in any way that we can. Thanks for attending, guys.
I reiterate that. Yes, thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.